Hey there, night owls and history lovers. Tonight we're diving into the grimy, salt-crusted world of pirates, but not the romanticised version you see in movies. We're talking about the real deal, the unwashed, disease-ridden, storm-battered sailors who somehow managed to survive months at sea in conditions that would make a medieval dungeon seem luxurious. Before we set sail into this nautical nightmare, take a moment to hit that like button if you enjoy these deep dives into history's forgotten corners, and let me know in the comments what time zone you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the globe. Now settle in, maybe grab a cup of something warm, and let's explore how pirates dealt with three of their deadliest enemies: scurvy, storms, and the absolutely overwhelming stench of life at sea. When you think of pirates, your mind probably conjures images of swashbuckling adventurers with gleaming cutlasses and billowing coats, sailing pristine ships across crystal blue waters. The reality was far less glamorous. Picture this instead: a wooden vessel barely 60 feet long, packed with 30 to 50 unwashed men who hadn't seen fresh water for bathing in weeks. The air below deck was thick with the stench of human waste, rotting food, and the sour smell of bodies that had been marinating in their own sweat and grime. This wasn't a romantic adventure. This was survival at its most desperate, and every single day brought new challenges that could kill you in ways both swift and agonizingly slow. The Golden Age of Piracy, roughly spanning from the late 1600s to the early 1700s, was a time when the line between life and death was as thin as the planks beneath a pirate's feet. These weren't just criminals sailing around looking for treasure. They were men, and occasionally women, who had chosen a life where every sunrise was a small victory against overwhelming odds. They battled not just enemy ships and naval forces, but also the relentless assault of nature itself, diseases that could cripple an entire crew, and living conditions so foul that even rats sometimes abandoned ship. The three greatest threats to any pirate crew weren't cannonballs or cutlass wounds, though those certainly took their toll. No, the real killers were far more insidious. Scurvy crept through crews like a silent assassin, rotting teeth from gums and opening old wounds that refused to heal. Storms could appear without warning, turning the ocean into a churning hell that could swallow ships whole. And the constant, inescapable stink of life at sea wasn't just unpleasant. It was a symptom of conditions so unsanitary that disease festered in every corner of the ship. Let's start with scurvy, the pirates' most feared enemy. This wasn't some exotic tropical disease or a curse from ancient treasure. Scurvy was the result of something as simple as not eating the right foods. Yet it killed more sailors than all the naval battles of the era combined. The disease began quietly, almost politely. A sailor might notice his gums feeling a bit tender, maybe some unusual fatigue after climbing the rigging. But scurvy was patient. It had all the time in the world to destroy its victims, and destroyed them it did. Within weeks, the real horror began. Gums would swell and bleed, turning angry shades of purple and black. Teeth, once firmly rooted, would loosen and fall out with sickening ease. Old wounds and scars that had healed years earlier would mysteriously reopen, as if the body were forgetting how to repair itself. Sailors would develop strange dark spots across their skin, bruises that appeared without injury. Their hair would fall out in clumps, and their breath would take on a putrid, metallic smell that marked them as scurvy victims to anyone unfortunate enough to get close. But the physical symptoms were only the beginning. Scurvy attacked the mind as well as the body. Sailors would become irritable, then depressed, then completely irrational. Some would become convinced that their shipmates were plotting against them. Others would spend hours staring at the horizon, muttering to themselves about family members they'd left behind years ago. In the final stages, victims would simply lie in their hammocks, too weak to move, watching helplessly as their bodies fell apart around them. The truly maddening thing about scurvy was that the cure was so simple, yet so elusive for sailors spending months at sea. Fresh fruits and vegetables, particularly those containing what we now know as vitamin C, could prevent and even reverse the disease entirely. But how do you keep citrus fruits fresh during a 3-month voyage in the tropical heat? How do you grow vegetables on a wooden ship where every inch of space is precious? Pirates had to get creative, and their solutions were often as desperate as they were ingenious. Some crews would make brief stops at remote islands, desperately foraging for anything green and edible. Wild berries, strange fruits, even certain types of tree bark were consumed in the hope that they might stave off the disease. Pirates would trade precious supplies with indigenous peoples for local fruits, often paying far more than the items were worth, simply because they understood the life and death importance of fresh food. Others would attempt to grow sprouts and shoots in small containers below deck, though the lack of sunlight and the constant motion of the ship made this a challenging endeavour at best. The most successful pirate captains were those who understood that scurvy could destroy a crew faster than any enemy navy. They would plan their routes around islands known to have fruit trees, would maintain contacts with suppliers in various ports who could provide fresh provisions, and would sometimes even risk capture by making unplanned stops when scurvy began to appear among their men. It wasn't just about being a good leader, it was about basic mathematics. A crew reduced by scurvy couldn't fight, couldn't sail, and couldn't survive the next storm or battle. Some pirates developed their own folk remedies, concoctions that ranged from merely useless to actively dangerous. They would brew teas from seaweed, convinced that anything from the ocean must be good for sailors. They would mix various spices and herbs into their rum, creating medicinal cocktails that were probably more alcohol than medicine. Others would consume pickled vegetables that had been stored in barrels for months, not understanding that the pickling process had destroyed most of the nutrients that might have helped them. The psychological impact of watching crewmates succumb to scurvy cannot be overstated. Pirates were men accustomed to violence, to sudden death in battle, to the quick brutality of a cutlass fight or a cannon blast. But scurvy was different. It was slow, inevitable, and deeply personal. Watching a friend's teeth fall out, seeing strong men reduced to weak, bleeding shadows of themselves, created a constant atmosphere of dread that permeated every aspect of life aboard ship. Captains had to balance the crew's need for fresh provisions against the practical realities of piracy. Every stop at an island meant risk of discovery by naval forces. Every delay in pursuit of fresh fruit meant potentially missing a valuable target. Every decision about supplies meant weighing the immediate needs of the crew against their long-term survival and success. It was a constant juggling act that required not just nautical skill, but an understanding of human physiology that most pirates learned through bitter experience, rather than formal education. The social dynamics of scurvy were equally complex. In a world where strength and reliability meant survival, a sailor beginning to show symptoms of scurvy might find himself ostracized by his crewmates, not out of cruelty, but out of fear that his weakness would endanger everyone. Pirates had to trust each other absolutely in battle and in storms, and a man whose hands shook from scurvy, whose vision was failing, whose mind was clouded by the disease, represented a potentially fatal liability. Yet there were also stories of remarkable loyalty and care among pirate crews dealing with scurvy. Some captains would share their own private stores of preserved fruits with sick crew members. Others would risk everything to find medical help at ports where pirates were decidedly unwelcome. The bonds forged by shared suffering and mutual dependence often proved stronger than the selfish reputation pirates cultivated in the popular imagination. The economic impact of scurvy on pirate operations was devastating. A crew that lost even a quarter of its members to the disease would find itself unable to operate effectively. Fewer men meant slower sailing, reduced fighting capability, and difficulty managing the complex systems required to keep a ship operational. Pirates operated on narrow profit margins, sharing their take among the crew according to strict codes and agreements. When scurvy reduced the number of active crew members, the survivors might find themselves with larger individual shares, but from much smaller overall profits because their reduced numbers limited their ability to capture and manage prizes. The irony was that many pirate ships captured vessels loaded with exactly the kinds of fresh provisions that could have prevented scurvy. Spanish treasure galleons often carried supplies of citrus fruits for their own crews. Merchant vessels frequently transported barrels of pickled vegetables, preserved fruits, and other foods that contained the nutrients pirates desperately needed. Yet the focus on gold, silver, and other immediately valuable cargo meant that these life-saving supplies were often overlooked or quickly consumed without understanding their true worth. This short-sightedness wasn't entirely the fault of individual pirates. Medical knowledge of the time was primitive at best, and the connection between diet and scurvy wouldn't be fully understood for decades to come. Even naval forces of major powers struggled with the disease, losing thousands of trained sailors to what we now know was entirely preventable malnutrition. Pirates, operating outside the formal medical establishments of their time, had to rely on folk wisdom, trial and error, and the hard-won experience of sailors who had survived previous outbreaks. The treatment of scurvy victims varied dramatically from ship to ship and captain to captain. Some pirate crews would abandon sick members at the first opportunity, viewing them as dead weight that threatened the survival of the healthy. Others developed surprisingly sophisticated care systems, with designated crew members responsible for tending to the sick and managing the limited medical supplies available. The most successful pirate captains understood that their crew's health was their most valuable asset, worth more than any single treasure they might capture. The reality of treating scurvy at sea was often more gruesome than the disease itself. Pirates would attempt crude surgical procedures, trying to drain infected gums or remove rotting teeth with whatever tools they had available. Imagine having a tooth extracted by a shipmate using a pair of rusty pliers, with nothing but rum to dull the pain and a piece of leather to bite down on. These amateur operations, performed in filthy conditions with unsterilized instruments, often led to infections that were worse than the original symptoms. Some crews developed elaborate rituals around scurvy prevention, born more from desperation than medical knowledge. They would force crew members to chew on pieces of leather that had been soaked in vinegar, believing the acid would somehow cleanse their blood. Others would make their men swallow concoctions of gunpowder mixed with water, convinced that the sulphur would purify their systems. These folk remedies were passed down from sailor to sailor like precious secrets, even though they were completely useless and sometimes actively harmful. The psychological warfare that scurvy waged on pirate crews was perhaps its most insidious aspect. Men who had faced down naval warships and survived brutal sword fights would break down completely when faced with the slow dissolution of their own bodies. The disease didn't just kill, it humiliated. Strong men would find themselves unable to chew their food, reduced to sucking on pieces of hardtack until it dissolved into mush. Pirates who had once struck terror into the hearts of merchant sailors would weep like children as their hair fell out in handfuls. But scurvy was just one of the 3 great killers stalking every pirate ship. If the disease didn't get you, the storm certainly would try. The ocean was an unforgiving mistress, and she had 1,000 ways to kill unwary sailors. Unlike modern vessels with their steel hulls and sophisticated navigation equipment, pirate ships were essentially wooden boxes held together by tar, rope, and prayer. When a serious storm hit, survival became a matter of luck as much as skill. The first sign of an approaching storm was often deceptively gentle. A slight change in the wind's direction, a subtle shift in the colour of the clouds on the horizon. Experienced sailors learned to read these signs like a language written in air and water, but storms at sea could develop with terrifying speed, transforming calm waters into churning nightmares in a matter of hours. Pirates had no weather satellites, no radio reports, no advance warning beyond what their own senses could provide. When a storm struck, the orderly world of the pirate ship dissolved into chaos. The deck, normally a place of work and social gathering, became a slippery death trap where a single misstep could send a man sliding into the churning sea. Waves that seemed impossibly tall would crash over the rails, sending torrents of freezing water cascading across the deck and down into the lower levels of the ship. The sound was overwhelming, a constant roar of wind and water that made communication nearly impossible. Below deck during a storm was its own special hell. The ship would pitch and roll with such violence that men would be thrown against the walls like rag dolls. Anything not securely fastened would become a deadly projectile, flying through the cramped spaces and striking anyone unlucky enough to be in its path. Barrels of water and food would break loose from their restraints, their contents spilling across the already treacherous floor. The smell of vomit would mix with the existing stench of the ship, as even the most seasoned sailors found their stomachs rebelling against the constant, violent motion. The psychological terror of a storm at sea was unlike anything landsmen could imagine. The ship would climb mountainous waves, reaching what felt like impossible heights, before plunging down into valleys of water so deep that the sky disappeared entirely. For those terrifying moments in the troughs between waves, the world consisted only of walls of grey-green water rising on all sides, threatening to collapse inward and crush the tiny vessel. Then the ship would climb again, often at such steep angles that men had to cling to whatever they could find to avoid sliding to the back of the vessel. Pirates had developed their own methods for surviving storms, techniques passed down through generations of sailors who had lived to tell their tales. The most important rule was to secure everything that could possibly move. Cannons, massive iron beasts that could weigh over 1,000 pounds, had to be lashed down with heavy ropes and chains. Even then, the violent motion of the ship could cause these restraints to snap, sending the cannons careening across the deck like enormous bowling balls, crushing anything in their path. The crew would work in shifts during storms, with some men constantly bailing water from the lower levels of the ship, while others struggled to keep the sails properly managed. Too much sail, and the wind could snap the masts or tear the canvas to shreds. Too little, and the ship would lose the ability to navigate, becoming helpless prey to whatever direction the storm chose to push it. The balance required constant adjustment, with sailors risking their lives climbing into the rigging during the height of the tempest to adjust the sails by hand. Food and fresh water became critical concerns during extended storms. The constant motion made cooking nearly impossible, and the risk of fire from overturned lamps or cooking fires was too great to ignore. Pirates would subsist on whatever cold provisions they had available, often going days without hot food or drink. Fresh water, already precious on any sea voyage, could be contaminated by salt spray or lost entirely if storage barrels were damaged by the storm's violence. Sleep during a storm was a luxury few could afford. Even when not actively working to keep the ship afloat, the noise and motion made rest nearly impossible. Men would wedge themselves into corners or tie themselves into their hammocks to avoid being thrown about, but even then, the constant anxiety of wondering whether the next wave would be the one to sink the ship kept most sailors awake for days at a time. Exhaustion became another enemy, as tired men made mistakes that could prove fatal to themselves and their crewmates. The damage assessment after a storm often revealed just how close to disaster the crew had come. Sails would be torn and need immediate repair or replacement. Rigging would be tangled or broken, requiring hours of careful work to restore. The ship's hull might have suffered damage below the waterline, necessitating dangerous repairs while still at sea. Pirates became experts at emergency carpentry, using whatever materials they had available to patch holes and shore up weakened structures. Perhaps most terrifying were the storms that seemed to go on forever. What started as a day-long ordeal would stretch into 2 days, then 3, then a week. Supplies would run dangerously low. Men would begin to show signs of exhaustion, induced madness, and the ship itself would start to show the strain of constant battering. Some storms were so severe that they would drive ships hundreds of miles off course, leaving crews lost in unfamiliar waters with damaged navigation equipment and dwindling supplies. The social dynamics during storms revealed the true character of pirate crews. Some would pull together, with experienced sailors helping newcomers learn the ropes. literally and figuratively. Others would fracture under the pressure, with men looking out only for themselves and abandoning their duties when the going got particularly rough. Captains had to maintain discipline and morale during these trials, often through a combination of leadership, threats, and personal example. A captain who showed fear during a storm might find his authority permanently undermined, while one who remained calm and competent could earn loyalty that would last for years. The superstitions surrounding storms were as varied as they were strongly held. Some pirates believed that whistling on deck would bring wind, while others thought it would anger the sea spirits. Certain crews would refuse to sail on particular days of the week, convinced that storms were more likely on those dates. Others carried elaborate charms and talismans, believing that these objects could protect them from the ocean's wrath. While an important psychological function, giving sailors these beliefs had no scientific basis, they served some sense of control in situations where they were essentially helpless. Navigation during storms was an art form in itself, with the sun and stars obscured by clouds and with the ship being pushed far off wind and current, its intended course by determining location became nearly impossible. Pirates relied on dead reckoning, essentially educated guessing based on their last known position and their estimates of speed and direction. These calculations were often wildly inaccurate, leading to ships arriving at islands days or weeks later than expected, or missing their destinations entirely. The economic impact of storms on pirate operations was enormous. A single severe storm could damage a ship so badly that months of profitable raiding would be required just to pay for repairs. Sails were expensive and had to be replaced regularly. Rigging required constant maintenance. The ship's hull needed periodic careening, a process where the vessel would be pulled up onto a beach and cleaned, repaired, and waterproofed. All of these necessities cut into the profits that pirates risked their lives to earn. But even if a crew survived the scurvy and weathered the storms, they still had to deal with the third great challenge of pirate life, the absolutely overwhelming, inescapable, soul-crushing stench that permeated every aspect of existence aboard ship. This wasn't just an unpleasant inconvenience. The smell was a constant reminder of just how far removed from civilized life these men had become, and it carried with it very real health consequences that could be as deadly as any disease or tempest. The reality of the stench aboard pirate ships defied imagination. Picture the worst smell you've ever encountered, multiply it by 100, then imagine being trapped with it in a confined space for months at a time with no escape. The odour wasn't just offensive, it was layered, complex, and constantly evolving as new sources of putrefaction added their contributions to the olfactory nightmare. At its foundation was the smell of unwashed human bodies, dozens of men who hadn't bathed in weeks or months, their skin caked with salt, sweat, and grime that had accumulated into a second epidermis of filth. But body odour was just the beginning. The ship's bilge, the lowest part of the hull where water collected, became a fetid soup of seawater, human waste, rotting food scraps, and whatever other organic matter had found its way below deck. This mixture would slosh back and forth with every movement of the ship, creating a constantly churning cauldron of decomposition that sent noxious fumes wafting up through the deck planks. The smell was so penetrating that it seemed to seep into the wood itself, becoming a permanent part of the ship's character. Food storage added another layer to the aromatic assault. Without refrigeration, preserving food for long voyages required techniques that were often as foul as they were effective. Salt pork would be packed in barrels with so much salt that the meat became leather-hard and took on a greyish, unappetising colour. Hardtack biscuits would become infested with weevils and other insects, adding the sweet smell of decay to their already musty odour. Water stored in wooden casks would develop a greenish tinge and a taste so revolting that even desperate sailors would mix it with rum just to make it palatable. The combination of poor ventilation and constant dampness created perfect conditions for mould and mildew to flourish. Every surface below deck would develop a fuzzy coating of various fungi, each contributing its own distinctive aroma to the ship's bouquet. Clothing, bedding, and personal possessions would all succumb to this biological assault, becoming damp, slimy, and reeking with the earthy smell of decomposition. Pirates would often prefer to sleep on deck under the stars rather than endure the concentrated stench of the lower levels. Personal hygiene, already a foreign concept to many sailors of the era, became virtually impossible aboard ship. Fresh water was far too precious to waste on bathing, and seawater baths were not only impractical but actually counterproductive, as the salt would dry on the skin and create painful, itchy rashes. Pirates would go weeks without changing their clothes, wearing the same shirts and breeches until they literally fell apart from rotten wear. The fabric would become stiff with accumulated sweat and grime, taking on a life of its own as bacteria and parasites made their homes in the fibres. The lack of proper sanitation facilities created its own special category of horror. Most pirate ships had a simple wooden seat suspended over the ocean at the bow of the ship, grandly called the head, but really nothing more than a hole where waste would theoretically fall into the sea. In rough weather, using this facility became a dangerous adventure, with men risking being swept overboard while attending to basic bodily functions. Many sailors simply relieved themselves wherever convenient, adding to the general atmosphere of filth that pervaded the ship. Vermin were constant companions on every pirate vessel. Rats scurried through the lower levels, feeding on stored food and leaving their own contributions to the ship's aromatic profile. These weren't just a few scattered rodents, but entire colonies that could number in the hundreds. They would gnaw through food containers, contaminate water supplies, and leave droppings throughout the ship. Cockroaches thrived in the warm, damp conditions, emerging at night in vast numbers to feed on crumbs and organic matter. Sailors would often wake to find these insects crawling across their faces and bodies. Lice and fleas were perhaps the most personal torment. Every pirate carried these parasites, and they would spread throughout the crew with remarkable efficiency. The constant itching and scratching would leave men covered in sores and scabs, which would then become infected in the unsanitary conditions. Pirates would sometimes hold delousing sessions, picking through each other's hair and clothing in futile attempts to control the infestations, but in the confined quarters of a ship, reinfection was inevitable. The smell of death was never far away on a pirate ship. Men who died from disease, injury, or violence couldn't always be buried at sea immediately, especially during battles or storms. Bodies would sometimes remain below deck for days, adding the sweet, cloying smell of human decomposition to the ship's already overwhelming odour. Even after burial, the memory of that smell would linger, seeming to permeate the wood and canvas of the vessel. Medical treatment, such as it was, created its own aromatic challenges. Pirates would use whatever substances they believed might heal wounds or treat illness, often with disastrous results. Tar was commonly applied to cuts and injuries, creating a sticky, foul-smelling mess that usually did more harm than good. Various herbs and spices would be mixed into poultices and applied to wounds, rotting in the heat and humidity and adding their own distinctive odours to the patient's suffering. The psychological impact of living in such conditions cannot be overstated. The constant assault on the senses wore down even the hardiest sailors, contributing to the general atmosphere of desperation and brutality that characterized pirate life. Men became inured to smells that would make civilized people violently ill, but this adaptation came at a cost. Pirates who returned to port after months at sea would often find themselves unwelcome in taverns and boarding houses, their own odour so offensive that even the most disreputable establishments would turn them away. Attempts to mask or eliminate the smell were largely futile. Some crews would burn aromatic woods or herbs when supplies allowed, creating brief respites from the overwhelming stench. Others would splash vinegar or rum around the ship, hoping the strong scents would provide some relief. The most desperate would hold burning sulphur below deck, a practice that was not only ineffective, but potentially deadly in the confined space of a ship's hold. The social hierarchy aboard ship was partly determined by proximity to the worst smells. Officers and senior crew members would claim the areas with the best ventilation, usually near the stern of the ship, where prevailing winds would carry some of the odour away. Junior sailors and new crew members would be relegated to the worst areas, often sleeping directly above the bilge, where the concentration of foul odours was most intense. This arrangement wasn't just about comfort, it was about survival. Extended exposure to the worst conditions could weaken a man's constitution and make him more susceptible to disease. Cooking in these conditions was an adventure in itself. The ship's cook, often one of the least popular members of the crew, had to prepare meals using ingredients that were already spoiled or infested with insects. The galley, usually nothing more than a small area with a brick-lined firebox, would fill with smoke and steam that carried the concentrated essence of whatever rotting provisions were being prepared. Meals were often consumed as quickly as possible, not just because of hunger, but because lingering over food allowed the full impact of its appearance and smell to register. The impact on mental health was severe. Men who had once taken pride in their appearance would become slovenly and apathetic. The constant exposure to filth and stench seemed to coarsen not just their bodies, but their spirits as well. Many pirates developed a fatalistic attitude, believing that cleanliness and comfort were luxuries they could never again enjoy. This psychological deterioration contributed to the reputation for brutality and callousness that pirates cultivated, as men who had lost their connection to basic human dignity found it easier to commit acts of violence and cruelty. Trade and interaction with other ships became complicated by the pirates' overwhelming odour. Merchant vessels could often smell a pirate ship approaching from miles away, the distinctive reek carrying on the ocean breeze, like an advance warning. This made surprise attacks more difficult and gave potential victims time to prepare or attempt escape. Even when pirates successfully captured prizes, the crews they encountered would often be nauseated by their captors' appearance and smell, making negotiations and information gathering more challenging. Some pirate captains recognised that their crew's hygiene, or lack thereof, was becoming a tactical disadvantage. They would attempt to institute cleaning routines and standards, but these efforts were usually short-lived. The practical challenges of maintaining cleanliness at sea, combined with the crew's resistance to what they saw as unnecessary luxury, made sustained improvement nearly impossible. A few enlightened captains would schedule regular stops at remote beaches where the crew could bathe and wash their clothes. But these opportunities were rare and often cut short by the need to avoid detection by naval forces. The economic consequences of the stench were significant. Pirates who managed to capture valuable cargo would often find that their own odour had contaminated the goods, reducing their value when sold in port. Textiles would absorb the ship's reek and become difficult to sell. Food items would be tainted by association. Even gold and silver, theoretically immune to such problems, would sometimes carry the smell of the ship where they had been stored, marking them as pirate treasure and making them harder to fence. The contrast between the pirates' living conditions and those of their victims was stark. Merchant sailors, while certainly not living in luxury, generally maintained much higher standards of cleanliness and sanitation. Naval vessels, with their strict discipline and regular supply of fresh provisions, were positively pristine by comparison. This disparity reinforced the social divide between pirates and legitimate sailors, making it harder for pirates to blend in when they attempted to return to conventional maritime life. The stench became part of pirate identity, a badge of dishonour that marked them as outcasts from civilized society. Some embraced this aspect of their reputation, using their overwhelming odour as a weapon of psychological warfare. The mere appearance of a crew of unwashed, reeking pirates could sometimes convince merchant vessels to surrender without a fight. their crews too disgusted and demoralised to mount effective resistance. But the smell wasn't just about poor hygiene and bad living conditions. It was a symptom of deeper problems that plagued pirate society. The inability or unwillingness to maintain basic standards of cleanliness reflected the desperate nature of their existence, the constant prioritisation of immediate survival over long-term health and comfort. Every day spent dealing with the overwhelming stench was another day further removed from the civilised world they had left behind. The irony was that many pirates had originally been sailors on legitimate vessels, men who had once maintained reasonable standards of cleanliness and hygiene. The transformation from respectable seaman to reeking outlaw was often gradual, a slow descent into squalor that paralleled their moral and social degradation. By the time they fully realised how far they had fallen, the path back to respectability seemed impossibly distant. Yet despite all these challenges, despite the disease, the storms, and the overwhelming stench, pirates continued to choose this life. The promise of freedom, adventure, and sudden wealth was powerful enough to overcome even the most appalling living conditions. They developed coping mechanisms, found ways to endure what seemed unendurable, and created their own twisted version of civilization in the midst of chaos and filth. Understanding how pirates dealt with these three great challenges, scurvy, storms, and stench, provides insight into both their remarkable resilience and their tragic degradation. These weren't just colourful details about life at sea. They were fundamental aspects of an existence so harsh that it shaped every decision, every relationship, and every moment of their lives. The solutions they developed, crude and often ineffective as they were, represented human ingenuity in its most desperate form. Pirates who survived years at sea had mastered arts of endurance that few people in history have ever had to learn. They had discovered the absolute minimum requirements for human survival and had found ways to meet them under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. But their methods came at a terrible cost. The physical and psychological toll of life under such conditions was enormous, creating men who were hardened beyond recognition, who had sacrificed their health, their dignity, and often their humanity in pursuit of freedom and fortune on the high seas. The story of how pirates dealt with scurvy, storms, and stink is ultimately a story about the extremes of human adaptability, about what people will endure and how they will change when pushed to the very limits of survival. It's a reminder that the romantic image of piracy obscures a reality that was far more complex, far more challenging, and far more tragic than most people realise. The ingenuity born of desperation extended far beyond just surviving the big three killers. Pirates developed an entire ecosystem of survival techniques that would make modern survivalists weep with admiration. Take their approach to fresh water, for instance. Every drop was precious, yet they needed gallons per day just to keep a crew alive. They learned to catch rainwater using every available surface, stretching canvas and sailcloth to funnel precious precipitation into barrels. During storms, while most of the crew fought to keep the ship afloat, a few would be assigned the vital task of water collection, risking their lives to position containers in the path of the driving rain. But rainwater collection was just the beginning. Pirates became masters of water conservation that would put modern environmentalists to shame. They would reuse washing water for cleaning the deck, then use that same water for swabbing down the cannon, and finally let it drain into the bilge, where it would at least help dilute the toxic soup that accumulated there. Drinking water was so precious that it was often mixed with wine or rum, not just to make it palatable, but to kill the bacteria that inevitably contaminated their supplies. The hierarchy of water access revealed the brutal social structure of pirate society. Officers got the cleanest water, served in relatively clean containers. Regular crew members received their rations from communal barrels that had been contaminated by dozens of dirty hands and unwashed cups. The newest crew members, those at the bottom of the pecking order, often had to make do with water that had been standing for weeks, green with algae and thick with sediment. Water discipline was enforced with the same violence that governed every other aspect of pirate life. Men caught stealing water rations might find themselves flogged, keel-hauled, or simply thrown overboard. The temptation was enormous, especially during long stretches without rainfall, when the daily ration might be reduced to a few precious sips. Pirates would lie awake at night, listening to the gentle slosh of water in the barrels, calculating how many days remained before they would die of thirst. The psychological torture of water scarcity was almost worse than the physical effects. Men would dream of clear streams and flowing rivers, waking to the harsh reality of their stinking, limited supply. Some would become obsessed with their water rations, hoarding every drop and refusing to use any for washing or cleaning. Others would drink their entire daily ration immediately upon receiving it, unable to resist the temptation, even knowing they would suffer for hours until the next distribution. Food preservation techniques among pirates were equally desperate and ingenious. Without refrigeration, keeping meat edible for months required methods that often made the cure worse than the original problem. Salt pork became so encrusted with preserving salt that it had to be soaked for hours just to make it chewable. The soaking process would remove much of the salt, but it would also create a breeding ground for bacteria in the warm, humid conditions below deck. Hardtack biscuits, the staple carbohydrate of every pirate crew, were baked to be as hard as stone specifically to resist spoilage. These concrete-like discs could last for months without rotting, but they required special techniques to consume. Pirates would soak them in whatever liquid was available, usually rum or the ship's increasingly questionable water supply. The soaking would reveal the true horror of hardtack storage, as weevils and other insects that had been baked into the biscuits would float to the surface, creating a protein-rich but visually disturbing soup. The most experienced pirates learned to eat their hardtack in the dark, using touch and taste rather than sight to guide their consumption. What you couldn't see couldn't revolt you, and the protein from the insects was actually beneficial, though few pirates understood the nutritional science behind their disgust-driven dietary habits. Fishing became an art form among pirate crews, not just for the fresh protein it provided, but for the psychological boost of consuming something that hadn't been rotting in a barrel for months. Pirates would trail lines behind their ships constantly, hoping to catch whatever was following in their wake. But fishing from a moving vessel required special techniques and equipment that most landlubbers would never master. The most successful fishing happened during calm periods when the ship could afford to slow down or even stop entirely. Pirates would use every scrap of metal they could find to fashion hooks, and would create lures from anything shiny or colourful in their possession. Bits of cloth, fragments of broken glass, even buttons cut from clothing would be pressed into service as fishing tackle. Catching fish was only half the battle. Without ice or refrigeration, fresh fish had to be consumed immediately or preserved using the same brutal techniques applied to other meats. Pirates became expert at quick smoking fish over small fires, creating jerky-like strips that could last for days. Others would salt their catch immediately, packing it in precious salt supplies to create a form of primitive ceviche that could be stored for limited periods. The social dynamics around fresh fish were complex and often violent. A successful fisherman might find his catch claimed by higher-ranking crew members, leaving him with nothing despite his efforts. Smart pirates learned to fish secretly, consuming their catch immediately rather than risk having it confiscated. Others would use their fishing success as a bargaining chip, trading fresh fish for favours, better sleeping positions, or protection from ship bullies. Navigation without modern instruments required skills that bordered on the supernatural. Pirates had to read the ocean like a book, interpreting subtle changes in watercolour, wave patterns, and wildlife behaviour to determine their location and heading. The most experienced navigators could predict weather changes days in advance by observing cloud formations and wind patterns that would be invisible to untrained eyes. Star navigation was an art passed down from older sailors to younger ones, but it required clear skies and a steady platform for observation. Pirates would sometimes risk their lives climbing to the top of swaying masts during calm nights, using crude instruments to take readings on celestial bodies. These observations had to be combined with dead reckoning, essentially educated guessing about the ship's speed and direction over time. The margin for error in pirate navigation was enormous and often fatal. A miscalculation could send a ship hundreds of miles off course into unknown waters where fresh water and supplies were unavailable. Pirates might sail for weeks thinking they were approaching a familiar island, only to find empty ocean stretching to every horizon. The psychological impact of being lost at sea, with supplies dwindling and no land in sight, could break even the strongest crews. Maps and charts were precious commodities among pirate crews, often worth more than gold or silver in practical terms. These documents were usually stolen from captured vessels or copied by hand from memory by sailors who had served on legitimate ships. The accuracy of such maps varied wildly, and pirates often found that their carefully preserved charts bore little resemblance to actual coastlines and harbours. Some pirates became famous for their navigational skills, able to find tiny islands in vast expanses of ocean using nothing but their accumulated knowledge and intuition. These men were treasured by their crews and could often negotiate better terms and treatment based on their invaluable abilities. But navigation was as much art as science, and even the best navigators could be defeated by unexpected weather, equipment failure, or simple bad luck. The social structure aboard pirate ships was far more complex than the democratic ideals they supposedly embraced. While it was true that many pirate crews elected their captains and made major decisions by today reality vote, the day of ship life was governed by a harsh hierarchy based on strength, experience, and usefulness. New crew members, whether volunteers or pressed men, found themselves at the bottom of a brutal social ladder that determined everything from food rations to sleeping locations. Establishing your place in the crew hierarchy often required violence or the threat of violence. Pirates would test new members through hazing rituals that could range from relatively harmless pranks to genuinely dangerous ordeals. A man who couldn't defend himself or demonstrate useful skills would quickly find himself assigned to the worst duties and given the smallest share of food and water. The ship's officers, while technically elected, maintained their positions through a combination of competence and intimidation. A quartermaster who couldn't control the crew's behaviour would soon find himself voted out of office. But the voting process itself was often influenced by fear and favouritism rather than democratic principles. Pirates who challenged the leadership had to be prepared for violent retaliation, even if their challenges were technically within the crew's rights. Discipline aboard pirate ships was swift and brutal. Unlike naval vessels with their formal court-martial procedures, pirates administered justice through crude tribunals that were as much about entertainment as punishment. Flogging was common for minor offences, but creative punishments were preferred for their psychological impact. Keel hauling, where a man was dragged under the ship's hull, often proved fatal due to the razor-sharp barnacles that accumulated on the wooden surface. The most feared punishment was marooning, where offenders would be abandoned on deserted islands with minimal supplies. This wasn't just a death sentence, it was a slow, psychologically torturous death sentence that could take weeks or months to complete. The threat of marooning kept most crew members in line, as they understood that their survival depended entirely on remaining part of the group. But pirate justice wasn't entirely arbitrary. Most crews operated under written articles that spelled out rules, punishments, and the distribution of prizes. These documents, when they survived, reveal a complex legal system that addressed everything from the treatment of prisoners to the compensation for injuries sustained in battle. Pirates might have been outlaws, but they weren't anarchists. They understood that survival required order, even if that order was enforced through violence. The distribution of captured treasure followed strict protocols that varied from ship to ship, but always reflected the crew's understanding of risk and reward. Captains typically received the largest share, usually 2 or 3 times what ordinary crew members got, but even this was modest compared to the vast disparities found in legitimate naval or merchant services. The democratic ideals of piracy were most evident in these distribution systems, where every man who participated in a successful raid received a predetermined share. But the reality of pirate economics was far more complex than simple treasure distribution. Most pirate raids yielded not chests of gold and silver, but mundane cargo that had to be converted into usable wealth. Captured textiles, spices, tools, and other goods had to be sold in ports where pirates were welcome, and these transactions often involved significant losses to middlemen and corrupt officials. The feast or famine nature of pirate economics created psychological pressures that contributed to the violent culture aboard ship. A crew that had been living on short rations for months might suddenly find themselves wealthy beyond their dreams after a successful raid, only to see that wealth disappear through poor planning, bad luck, or simple profligacy. The boom and bust cycle created men who were simultaneously desperate and reckless, capable of great generosity and extreme violence depending on their current circumstances. Personal possessions among pirates were minimal and fiercely protected. In a world where everything you owned had to fit in a small sea chest, every item had to justify its space and weight. Pirates would carry a few changes of clothing, personal weapons, perhaps a few sentimental items from their former lives. These possessions took on enormous psychological importance, representing the last connections to their identities as individual human beings rather than interchangeable parts of the ship's crew. The loss of personal items, whether through theft, damage, or simple wear, could trigger violent confrontations that seemed disproportionate to outside observers. But on a ship where men had already sacrificed their families, their homes, and their legal identities, a stolen knife or damaged coat could represent the final loss of individual dignity. Pirates would sometimes risk their lives to recover seemingly worthless personal items, not because of their practical value, but because they represented the last remnants of who they used to be. Gambling became an obsession among many pirate crews, offering both entertainment and the chance to improve one's position through luck rather than violence. Card games, dice, and elaborate betting schemes helped pass the long hours between raids, but they also created new sources of conflict and hierarchy. Successful gamblers could accumulate wealth and influence that rivaled the ship's formal officers, while unlucky players might find themselves in debt to crewmates who weren't hesitant to collect through violence. The psychology of men who had chosen to live outside all social conventions was complex and often contradictory. Pirates could display remarkable loyalty and courage in battle, then turn on each other with shocking brutality over trivial disputes. They created their own codes of honor that seemed to make sense within the context of their harsh world, but these codes often appeared completely irrational to outside observers. Some pirates maintained elaborate fantasies about their eventual return to respectable society, carefully saving money and planning for retirement even as they engaged in activities that made such returns impossible. Others embraced their outlaw status completely, reveling in their freedom from social constraints and taking pride in their reputation for violence and lawlessness. The religious beliefs of pirates were as varied as their backgrounds, but most maintained some form of spiritual practice even as they engaged in activities that violated every moral code they had been raised to respect. Some crews included men who had been intended for the clergy, educated individuals who could read and write and who often served as informal chaplains for their illiterate crewmates. Prayer before battles was common, as was the practice of making offerings to whatever gods might protect sailors. Pirates would often carry religious talismans alongside their weapons, seeking divine protection even as they engaged in activities that they understood to be sinful. This spiritual contradiction created psychological tensions that contributed to the mental instability that characterized many long-term pirates. The treatment of captured prisoners revealed both the brutality and the strange ethics of pirate society. While popular culture often depicts pirates as bloodthirsty killers, the reality was more complex. Dead prisoners provided no information and couldn't be ransomed, so there were practical incentives for keeping captives alive. But the conditions under which prisoners were held were often appalling, reflecting both the limited resources of pirate ships and the casual cruelty that pervaded their culture. Some pirates developed reputations for treating prisoners well, understanding that word of their humane behaviour would encourage future victims to surrender without fighting. Others cultivated reputations for extreme cruelty, believing that fear would make their raids more successful. Both approaches had their adherents, and the treatment prisoners could expect varied wildly depending on which crew had captured them and what mood the captain happened to be in. The integration of new crew members, whether volunteers or forced recruits, followed patterns that reflected the harsh realities of pirate life. Men who joined voluntarily were generally treated better than those who were pressed into service, but all newcomers had to prove their worth before being fully accepted. This proving process could take months and often involved tests that were as much about psychological resilience as physical capability. Former naval sailors were often viewed with suspicion by pirate crews, who worried that these men might retain loyalties to their former services or possess knowledge that could be used against pirates. But naval experience was also valuable, as these men understood ship operations, navigation, and combat in ways that merchant sailors or landsmen did not. The integration of such men required careful management by pirate leaders who had to balance the benefits of their expertise against the risks of their potential betrayal. The evolution of individual pirates over time revealed the psychological toll of their chosen lifestyle. Men who had initially been driven to piracy by economic desperation or personal tragedy often found themselves changed in fundamental ways by the experience. The constant violence, the social isolation, the physical hardships, and the moral compromises required for survival at sea created individuals who bore little resemblance to who they had been before. Some pirates adapted to their new lives with disturbing ease, suggesting either remarkable psychological flexibility or pre-existing tendencies toward violence and antisocial behaviour. Others struggled constantly with the contradictions between their actions and their moral beliefs, creating internal conflicts that manifested in various forms of mental illness and self-destructive behaviour. The few pirates who successfully returned to legitimate society often found the transition extremely difficult. Years of living outside social conventions, of resolving disputes through violence, of taking what they needed rather than earning it through conventional means, left many former pirates unable to adapt to the constraints and expectations of normal life. Some would attempt to go straight only to return to piracy within months, finding that they had become fundamentally incompatible with civilized society. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of pirate psychology was their ability to create functional communities under the most adverse circumstances imaginable. Despite the violence, the disease, the constant threat of death, and the appalling living conditions, pirate crews managed to work together effectively enough to challenge the naval forces of major empires. They developed systems of governance, resource distribution, and conflict resolution that, while crude and often brutal, were sophisticated enough to maintain group cohesion under extreme stress. The bonds forged between pirates often proved stronger than blood relationships or legal obligations. Men who had shared the experience of surviving storms, battles, and disease together developed loyalties that could transcend rational self-interest. These relationships provided emotional anchors in lives that were otherwise characterized by constant uncertainty and danger. Understanding the full reality of pirate existence requires looking beyond the romantic myths and examining the harsh truths of daily survival in one of history's most challenging environments. The men who chose this life weren't just seeking adventure and treasure. They were participating in a complex social experiment that tested the limits of human adaptability and revealed both the worst and occasionally the best aspects of human nature under extreme conditions. The stories that emerged from successful pirate raids were often far more complex than the simple smash-and-grab scenarios popularized in fiction. A typical pirate attack required weeks of planning, intelligence gathering, and careful positioning. Pirates weren't mindless raiders charging blindly at every ship they encountered. They were calculating predators who understood that their survival depended on choosing targets wisely and executing their plans with precision. The intelligence network that supported pirate operations was surprisingly sophisticated. Pirates maintained contacts in ports throughout the Caribbean and along the American coast, men and women who would provide information about valuable cargo, sailing schedules, and the defensive capabilities of potential targets. Tavern keepers, dock workers, corrupt officials, and even respectable merchants might serve as informants, motivated by money, fear, or their own grudges against particular shipping companies or governments. These intelligence networks required careful cultivation and constant maintenance. Pirates would spend significant portions of their profits maintaining relationships with informants, understanding that good information was often more valuable than additional firepower. A pirate crew that knew exactly what cargo a merchant vessel carried, how many armed men were aboard, and what route it planned to take had enormous advantages over one that simply attacked ships at random. The actual process of selecting targets revealed the strategic thinking that successful pirate captains had to master. A ship carrying a cargo of iron tools might be worth attacking if the pirates needed such items for their own use, but it would be a poor choice if they were looking for easily transportable wealth. Conversely, a vessel loaded with gold or silver might seem like an ideal target, but if it was heavily armed and escorted by warships, the risks might outweigh the potential rewards. Pirates had to balance multiple factors when choosing their prey. The value of the cargo was important, but so was the likelihood of capturing it successfully, the difficulty of converting it into usable wealth, and the potential consequences of the attack. Raiding a ship belonging to a powerful merchant house might bring swift retaliation, while attacking vessels from smaller companies might pass unnoticed by authorities. The approach phase of a pirate attack was a carefully choreographed performance designed to maximize psychological impact while minimizing actual fighting. Pirates understood that their reputation for violence was often more valuable than violence itself. A merchant crew that surrendered immediately saved the pirates from casualties, preserved the cargo from damage, and allowed the attack to be completed quickly before naval forces could respond. Pirates would often fly false colours during their approach, displaying the flags of friendly nations or legitimate merchant companies until they were close enough to reveal their true intentions. This deception required detailed knowledge of current political relationships, flag designs, and maritime protocols. A pirate crew that flew Spanish colours while approaching a Spanish merchant vessel needed to be prepared to answer questions in Spanish and demonstrate knowledge of Spanish naval procedures. The moment of revealing their true nature was carefully timed for maximum psychological impact. Pirates would suddenly raise their black flags, often accompanied by war cries, the firing of warning shots, and displays of weapons designed to terrify their intended victims. The goal was to create a moment of shock so complete that resistance would seem futile. But the psychology of the reveal was complex. Pirates had to appear dangerous enough to discourage resistance, while not seeming so bloodthirsty that their victims would fight to the death rather than surrender. The most successful pirate crews cultivated reputations for being deadly in battle, but reasonable in victory, encouraging surrender while maintaining their fearsome image. The boarding process itself was a dangerous moment when careful planning could dissolve into chaos. Pirates had to coordinate the movement of multiple small boats, manage the transfer of armed men between vessels in potentially rough seas, and maintain control over both their own ship and their prize simultaneously. A merchant crew that initially appeared to surrender might choose to fight once the pirates were spread out and vulnerable during the boarding process. Pirates developed specialized techniques for boarding that reflected their understanding of both seamanship and combat. They would approach from multiple directions when possible, overwhelming the defenders' ability to concentrate their fire. Grappling hooks and ropes were used to bind the ships together, while designated marksmen would target enemy officers and anyone attempting to organize resistance. The first moments after successful boarding were critical for establishing control. Pirates had to quickly identify and secure any weapons, subdue the crew, and prevent anyone from sending signals that might attract naval attention. But they also had to assess the cargo quickly, determining whether the raid had been worth the effort and risk involved. The treatment of captured crews varied enormously, depending on the pirates involved, the resistance they had encountered, and their assessment of future risks. Crews that surrendered immediately and provided useful information about their cargo often found themselves treated reasonably well. Those who had fought back or attempted to hide valuable items might face brutal interrogation and punishment. Pirates had to balance their need for information against the practical limitations of their situation. Torture might reveal hidden treasure, but it took time and created noise that could attract unwanted attention. Dead prisoners couldn't provide information about other valuable targets, but live prisoners required food, water, and supervision that strained the pirates' resources. The logistics of managing captured vessels presented their own challenges. A prize ship had to be sailed to a friendly port where its cargo could be sold, but this required splitting the pirate crew and potentially leaving both vessels vulnerable to recapture. Pirates had to make quick decisions about which crew members to assign to prize duty, balancing sailing expertise against loyalty and trustworthiness. Some prizes were simply too valuable or too large to abandon, even when managing them stretched the pirates' capabilities to the breaking point. A merchant vessel carrying a cargo worth thousands of pounds might require a prize crew of a dozen men, leaving the main pirate ship dangerously undermanned. But the potential profits from such captures could fund months of operations and significantly improve the crew's living conditions. The conversion of captured goods into usable wealth was often more challenging than the actual piracy itself. Pirates operating in the Caribbean might capture a cargo of fine textiles, but converting that cargo into gold or silver required finding buyers who were willing to purchase obviously stolen goods and who could be trusted not to betray the pirates to authorities. Corrupt officials and merchants in various ports served as essential intermediaries in this process, but they demanded significant percentages of the profits in exchange for their services. A cargo that might have been worth £1,000 to its original owner might bring the pirates only £200 or £300 after the various middlemen had taken their shares. The timing of these sales was crucial. Pirates who arrived in port with fresh prizes might find eager buyers willing to pay good prices for valuable cargo. But crews that had been at sea for months might find that their stolen goods had deteriorated in quality or that market conditions had changed, reducing the value of their prizes significantly. Some types of cargo were particularly problematic for pirates to handle. Livestock required constant care and feeding, making it difficult to maintain during long voyages. Perishable goods like fruit or fresh meat had to be consumed quickly, or they became worthless. Bulk commodities like lumber or grain were valuable but difficult to transport and store on the relatively small vessels that most pirates operated. The most successful pirate crews learned to specialize in particular types of targets and cargo that matched their capabilities and resources. Some focused on small, fast vessels carrying high-value, low-volume goods like spices or precious metals. Others preferred larger, slower ships with bulk cargoes that could be sold easily in friendly ports, even if the profit margins were smaller. The seasonal nature of shipping in the Caribbean created opportunities and challenges for pirate operations. The hurricane season made sailing dangerous for everyone, but it also disrupted regular shipping schedules and forced merchant vessels to take shelter in predictable locations where pirates could wait for them. The winter months brought treasure fleets from South America, heavily loaded but also heavily guarded. Pirates had to plan their operations around these seasonal patterns, understanding that their success depended as much on timing as on firepower or seamanship. A crew that positioned itself along major shipping routes during peak trading season might capture several valuable prizes in a matter of weeks, while the same crew operating during quiet periods might go months without encountering suitable targets. The intelligence networks that supported pirate operations were constantly evolving as authorities attempted to shut them down and as economic conditions changed. A reliable informant in Port Royal might suddenly become unavailable if colonial authorities cracked down on pirate activity, forcing crews to develop new sources of information or operate with less reliable intelligence. The most sophisticated pirate operations maintained multiple intelligence networks that could provide overlapping information and backup sources when primary contacts became unavailable. These networks required constant investment and careful management, but they provided the strategic advantages that separated successful long-term pirate crews from the opportunistic raiders who rarely survived more than a few months. Communication between different pirate crews was another aspect of their operations that required careful coordination. Pirates operating in the same general area had to balance cooperation against competition, sharing information about naval movements while protecting details about their own plans and successes. Some crews formed temporary alliances for major operations, combining their resources to attack targets that would have been too dangerous for individual ships. But these alliances were fragile and often short-lived. Pirates who had cooperated successfully in one operation might find themselves competing for the same prizes or fighting over the division of captured wealth. The lack of any higher authority to enforce agreements meant that pirate alliances depended entirely on mutual benefit and the personal relationships between captains and crew members. The reputation management that successful pirates engaged in was a complex balancing act that required understanding both their criminal colleagues and their intended victims. A pirate crew that developed a reputation for excessive cruelty might find that merchant ships would fight to the death rather than surrender, making every raid a costly battle. Conversely, pirates who were seen as too soft might be targeted by their own colleagues, or find their threats taken less seriously by potential victims. Some pirate captains became famous throughout the Caribbean, their names and reputations preceding them and influencing the behaviour of everyone they encountered. These reputations could be valuable assets, making raids more successful and crew recruitment easier, but they also made the pirates more visible to naval authorities and bounty hunters. The psychological warfare that pirates employed extended beyond their immediate victims to the broader maritime community. News of pirate attacks spread quickly through the informal networks that connected ports throughout the region, creating atmospheres of fear and uncertainty that could be more valuable to pirates than any individual raid. Merchant captains who had never encountered pirates personally might still alter their routes, increase their security measures, or avoid certain areas entirely based on rumours and stories about pirate activity. This broader impact multiplied the effectiveness of pirate operations, allowing relatively small numbers of pirates to disrupt commerce over vast areas of ocean. The counterintelligence efforts that pirates had to consider added another layer of complexity to their operations. Colonial authorities and naval forces actively worked to infiltrate pirate networks, turning informants against their former allies and gathering intelligence that could be used to predict and prevent pirate attacks. Pirates had to develop their own security measures, protecting sensitive information about their plans while still maintaining the intelligence networks they needed to operate successfully. This created constant tension between the need for information and the need for secrecy, requiring sophisticated judgment calls about who could be trusted and what information could be safely shared. The technological arms race between pirates and their opponents was constantly evolving as each side attempted to gain advantages over the other. Pirates might capture new types of weapons or navigation equipment that gave them temporary advantages, while naval forces developed new tactics and technologies designed specifically to counter pirate operations. The adaptation required to stay competitive in this environment demanded that successful pirates remain constantly alert to new developments and opportunities. Crews that relied too heavily on outdated tactics or equipment often found themselves outmatched by either their intended victims or the naval forces hunting them. The economic impact of successful pirate operations extended far beyond the immediate losses suffered by individual merchants and shipping companies. Insurance rates increased for vessels operating in areas where pirate activity was common, driving up the costs of legitimate commerce. Some shipping routes became so dangerous that they were effectively abandoned, forcing merchants to use longer, more expensive alternatives. These broader economic effects created political pressures that eventually led to increased anti-piracy efforts by colonial and European authorities. The Golden Age of Piracy ultimately ended not because individual pirates were defeated in battle, but because the economic disruption they caused became too costly for the emerging Atlantic economy to tolerate. The social networks that connected pirates to the broader Caribbean community were complex webs of relationships that included not just criminals and outcasts, but also respectable merchants, colonial officials, and even religious leaders who found ways to profit from pirate activities. These relationships were essential for the day-to-day operations of pirate crews, providing everything from supplies and repairs to banking services and legal protection. The corruption that made pirate operations possible was often systematic rather than individual, involving entire communities that had developed economic dependencies on pirate spending. Port towns that served as pirate bases might see their entire economies collapse if pirate activity in their area was successfully suppressed by naval forces. The cultural impact of pirates on Caribbean society was profound and lasting, creating legends and stories that influenced local traditions for generations after the Golden Age of Piracy had ended. Pirates became folk heroes in some communities, remembered not just as criminals, but as men who had challenged the established order and created their own alternative society. The documentation of pirate activities was often incomplete and biased, as most contemporary accounts were written either by their victims or by authorities attempting to justify anti-piracy measures. The pirates themselves were largely illiterate and left few first-hand accounts of their experiences, meaning that much of what we know about their operations comes from hostile sources. This documentary bias has contributed to both the romanticization and the demonization of pirates in popular culture, as later writers and historians had to fill in gaps in the historical record with speculation and imagination. The reality of pirate operations was probably both more mundane and more complex than most popular accounts suggest. The legal frameworks that governed responses to piracy were constantly evolving as authorities attempted to develop effective methods for dealing with criminals who operated across multiple jurisdictions and outside the normal structures of international law. Pirates could not be treated as prisoners of war because they represented no recognized government, but they also could not be handled through normal criminal justice systems because their crimes occurred on the high seas. Special Admiralty courts were established to handle piracy cases, but these courts often operated with limited evidence and faced practical challenges in gathering witnesses and testimony from victims who might be scattered across the Atlantic world. The legal proceedings against captured pirates were often rushed affairs designed more to demonstrate official resolve than to ensure justice. The international cooperation required to combat piracy effectively was difficult to achieve in an era when European powers were frequently at war with each other, and when colonial authorities often had competing interests and priorities. Pirates could exploit these political divisions, seeking refuge in territories controlled by nations that were hostile to their victims' home countries. The pardons and amnesty programs that various governments offered to pirates reflected both the difficulty of suppressing piracy through force alone and the recognition that many pirates were driven to their criminal careers by economic desperation rather than inherent criminality. These programs had mixed success, as some pirates genuinely sought to return to legitimate society, while others used pardons as opportunities to reorganize and resume their criminal activities. The transition from the Golden Age of Piracy to more conventional forms of maritime crime and naval warfare marked a fundamental shift in the nature of Atlantic commerce and international relations. The suppression of large-scale piracy was both a cause and an effect of the increasing organization and power of colonial governments and the growing importance of regulated international trade. The legacy of organized piracy didn't disappear overnight, but transformed into something more insidious and arguably more dangerous. As colonial authorities tightened their grip on traditional pirate havens and naval patrols made large-scale raiding increasingly risky, the survivors of the Golden Age had to adapt or perish. Some chose retirement, using their accumulated wealth to purchase respectability in remote settlements where questions about past occupations were rarely asked. Others found employment with governments that valued their expertise in maritime warfare, becoming privateers whose actions were legally sanctioned when directed against enemy nations. But a significant number of former pirates simply evolved their methods, becoming part of a shadowy underworld that continued to plague Atlantic shipping well into the 18th century. These new criminals were often more dangerous than their predecessors because they understood both the old ways of piracy and the new methods of law enforcement that had been developed to combat them. They knew how to avoid the naval patrols, how to exploit the gaps in colonial jurisdiction, and how to blend into legitimate maritime communities when the heat became too intense. The economic opportunities that had originally drawn men to piracy didn't disappear with the suppression of the major pirate crews. The Atlantic trade networks continued to expand, creating new vulnerabilities and new temptations for those willing to operate outside the law. Smuggling became increasingly sophisticated, with networks that rivaled the old pirate intelligence systems in their complexity and effectiveness. The skills that pirates had developed during the Golden Age proved remarkably transferable to other forms of maritime crime. Men who had learned to read weather patterns, navigate by the stars, and manage unruly crews found that these abilities were valuable in the emerging world of organized smuggling and illicit trade. The same networks that had once supported pirate operations were repurposed to move contraband goods, evade customs officials, and facilitate the illegal slave trade that continued to flourish despite increasing legal restrictions. The social relationships that had sustained pirate communities also proved remarkably durable. Former pirates maintained contact with each other through informal networks that stretched across the Atlantic world, sharing information about opportunities and threats, providing mutual assistance during difficult times, and occasionally reuniting for specific operations that required their combined expertise. These networks became particularly important as the legal and economic landscape continued to evolve. Former pirates who had successfully transitioned to legitimate occupations often found themselves in positions where they could assist their less fortunate former colleagues, providing information about shipping schedules, safe harbours, and corrupt officials who might be willing to look the other way for the right price. The maritime skills that pirates had mastered remained in high demand throughout the 18th century, as the expansion of Atlantic commerce required increasing numbers of experienced sailors who could handle the complex challenges of ocean navigation. Many former pirates found employment on legitimate merchant vessels, bringing their hard-won expertise to legal enterprises while maintaining the connections and attitudes that had served them during their criminal careers. The cultural impact of the Golden Age of Piracy extended far beyond the immediate participants and their victims. The stories and legends that grew up around famous pirate captains influenced popular perceptions of authority, legitimacy, and social order throughout the Atlantic world. Pirates became symbols of resistance to established power structures, inspiring later generations of rebels, revolutionaries, and social reformers. The literature and folklore that emerged from the pirate era reflected deep-seated tensions about class, nationality, and individual freedom that would continue to influence Atlantic societies for centuries to come. Pirates were simultaneously condemned as criminals and celebrated as folk heroes, representing both the dangers of lawlessness and the appeal of personal liberty unconstrained by traditional social hierarchies. The technological innovations that had been developed during the Golden Age of Piracy also had lasting impacts on maritime commerce and naval warfare. Pirates had been early adopters of new weapons, navigation techniques, and ship designs, often out of desperation, but sometimes with remarkable success. These innovations were gradually incorporated into legitimate maritime practices, improving the efficiency and safety of ocean travel for everyone. The medical knowledge that pirates had accumulated through their harsh experiences with disease and injury at sea contributed to broader improvements in maritime health and safety. The folk remedies and treatment techniques that had been developed through trial and error on pirate ships were often more effective than the formal medical practices of the time, and some of this knowledge found its way into legitimate medical practice through former pirates who became ship surgeons or port doctors. The organisational structures that pirates had created to manage their crews and operations provided models that were later adapted by legitimate maritime enterprises. The democratic decision-making processes, profit-sharing arrangements, and conflict resolution mechanisms that had been developed in pirate communities influenced the evolution of labour relations throughout the maritime industry. The international legal frameworks that were developed to combat piracy also had broader implications for the evolution of international law and maritime jurisdiction. The precedents established in piracy cases influenced later developments in areas such as international criminal law, maritime commerce regulation, and the legal status of stateless persons. The intelligence and communication networks that had supported pirate operations provided templates for later developments in international commerce, diplomacy, and espionage. The techniques that pirates had developed for gathering and transmitting information across vast distances and multiple jurisdictions proved remarkably adaptable to other purposes. The financial systems that had emerged to handle pirate wealth and support pirate operations contributed to the development of more sophisticated banking and credit arrangements throughout the Atlantic world. The methods that had been developed for converting stolen goods into usable currency, transferring wealth across international boundaries, and managing the financial risks of illegal enterprises influenced the evolution of legitimate financial institutions. The geographic knowledge that pirates had accumulated through their extensive travels and operations contributed significantly to the broader understanding of Atlantic geography, weather patterns, and navigation routes. Former pirates who found employment as pilots, navigators, or chart makers brought detailed knowledge of previously unexplored or poorly understood areas. The linguistic and cultural exchanges that had occurred within pirate communities, where men from dozens of different nationalities and backgrounds worked together in close quarters, contributed to the broader cultural mixing that characterized the Atlantic world. Pirates had developed their own multicultural societies decades before such diversity became common in legitimate colonial communities. The social experiments that pirates had conducted in their attempts to create alternative forms of community and governance provided examples and cautionary tales that influenced later political and social movements. The successes and failures of pirate democracy were studied by political theorists and social reformers who sought to understand the possibilities and limitations of radical social organization. The environmental knowledge that pirates had developed through their intimate relationship with the natural world of the Atlantic continued to influence maritime practices long after the Golden Age had ended. Pirates had become experts in reading natural signs, understanding weather patterns, and exploiting the resources of remote islands and coastlines. The survival techniques that had been perfected during the desperate conditions of pirate life found applications in other extreme situations throughout the Atlantic world. Shipwreck survivors, military expeditions, and colonial settlers all benefited from the hard-won knowledge that pirates had developed about surviving with minimal resources in hostile environments. The psychological insights that emerged from the study of pirate communities provided early examples of how extreme conditions could both corrupt and ennoble human behaviour. The documentation of how men responded to the complete absence of traditional social constraints offered lessons that would influence later understanding of human nature and social organisation. The economic analysis of pirate operations revealed important truths about the nature of international commerce, the role of violence in economic relationships, and the ways in which illegal enterprises could both disrupt and paradoxically support legitimate economic activity. These insights influenced the development of more sophisticated approaches to economic regulation and international trade policy. The technological transfer that occurred as pirates captured and adapted equipment from their victims accelerated the spread of innovations throughout the Atlantic world. Pirates served as inadvertent agents of technological diffusion, carrying new ideas and techniques between different regions and cultures. The social mobility that piracy had offered to men from the lowest levels of society provided a model that influenced later discussions about opportunity, merit, and social advancement. The fact that former slaves, indentured servants, and other marginalized individuals could rise to positions of leadership in pirate communities challenged traditional assumptions about social hierarchy and human potential. The international networks that had connected pirate communities across the Atlantic continued to facilitate various forms of exchange and communication long after their original criminal purposes had been abandoned. These networks became part of the broader infrastructure that supported the development of Atlantic civilization. The documentation and record-keeping practices that some pirate communities had developed, despite their generally low levels of literacy, contributed to the preservation of information about maritime life, colonial society, and international relations during a period when such records were often scarce. The conflict resolution mechanisms that pirates had developed to manage disputes within their communities without recourse to external authority provided models that were later adapted by other groups operating outside traditional legal frameworks. These techniques influenced the development of alternative dispute resolution methods and informal justice systems. The risk assessment and management strategies that pirates had developed to evaluate potential targets and minimize the dangers of their operations contributed to broader improvements in commercial risk analysis and maritime insurance practices. The mathematical and logical approaches that successful pirates had used to calculate odds and manage uncertainty proved applicable to many other areas of human endeavour. The leadership techniques that had been developed by successful pirate captains who had to maintain authority over diverse and potentially mutinous crews without the support of traditional institutional structures influenced later understanding of leadership in extreme and unconventional situations. The community-building practices that had enabled pirate crews to function effectively despite their diverse backgrounds and conflicting interests provided insights into the processes of social integration and group cohesion that would prove valuable in many other contexts. The adaptation strategies that pirates had developed to survive in constantly changing and hostile problem-solving that remained relevant long after the specific environments offered lessons about flexibility, resilience, and creative challenges of pirate life had disappeared. The resource management techniques that pirates had perfected in response to the severe constraints of life at sea contributed to broader knowledge about efficiency, conservation, and the optimal use of limited materials and supplies. The information warfare methods that pirates had employed to spread fear, gather intelligence, and manipulate public opinion provided early examples of techniques that would later be refined and systematized in military and political contexts. The cultural preservation efforts that some pirate communities had undertaken, maintaining traditions and practices from their members' diverse origins, contributed to the broader cultural diversity that characterized the Atlantic world and helped preserve knowledge and customs that might otherwise have been lost. The experimental approaches that pirates had taken to questions of governance, economics, and social organization provided a laboratory for testing ideas about human society that would later influence more formal political and economic theories. The maritime traditions that had been developed within pirate communities continue to influence seafaring culture throughout the Atlantic world, contributing to the evolution of nautical customs, superstitions, and practices that persisted well into the modern era. The entrepreneurial spirit that had driven many individuals to piracy found new outlets in legitimate business ventures as former pirates applied their skills and knowledge to legal enterprises. The risk-taking attitudes and innovative approaches that had characterized successful pirates often translated well to other forms of commercial activity. The international perspective that pirates had developed through their extensive travels and exposure to different cultures contributed to a more cosmopolitan worldview that influenced the development of Atlantic civilization. Pirates had been among the first truly international communities in the Atlantic world, and their experiences provided insights into the possibilities and challenges of cross-cultural cooperation. The survival stories and heroic narratives that emerged from the Golden Age of Piracy continued to inspire and influence popular culture throughout the Atlantic world, contributing to the development of distinctly American and Caribbean forms of literature, music, and folklore. The practical knowledge about ship construction, maintenance, and operation that pirates had accumulated through their extensive maritime experience contributed to improvements in shipbuilding and naval architecture throughout the region. Pirates had often been forced to improvise repairs and modifications under difficult conditions, leading to innovations that proved valuable in other contexts. The understanding of human psychology under extreme stress that had been developed through the harsh realities of pirate life provided insights that would later influence approaches to military training, crisis management, and organizational behavior in high-stress environments. The networking and relationship-building skills that had been essential for successful pirate operations proved transferable to many other areas of endeavor, as former pirates applied their abilities to build connections and facilitate cooperation in legitimate business and social contexts. The legacy of the Golden Age of Piracy was thus far more complex and enduring than the simple story of criminals who were eventually defeated by law and order. The men who had chosen to live outside conventional society during this remarkable period had created innovations, accumulated knowledge, and established networks that continued to influence the development of the Atlantic world long after their ships had rotted away and their black flags had been forgotten. The psychological transformation that occurred within pirate communities was perhaps more dramatic than any of their external achievements. Men who had entered this life carrying the moral frameworks and social expectations of their original societies found themselves gradually stripped of these familiar guideposts. The process wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was a slow erosion, like waves wearing away at a cliff face, barely noticeable from day to day, but ultimately creating entirely new landscapes of human behaviour and belief. The first casualty was usually the concept of legitimate authority. Pirates had rejected the legal frameworks that governed conventional society, but this rejection created a vacuum that had to be filled with something else. The democratic principles that many pirate crews adopted weren't born from political philosophy, but from practical necessity. When you've abandoned the idea that kings, governors, and magistrates have any right to command your obedience, you have to find new ways to organise collective action and resolve disputes. But pirate democracy was a harsh and limited thing, shaped by the constant threat of violence and the absolute requirements of survival at sea. Votes were often influenced by intimidation, and minority opinions could be dangerous to express. The famous pirate codes that governed crew behaviour weren't constitutional documents protecting individual rights. They were survival manuals designed to prevent the kind of internal conflicts that could destroy a crew when they needed unity most. The moral relativism that developed within pirate communities was both liberating and terrifying. Men who had once been bound by strict religious and social codes found themselves in environments where the only universal law was effectiveness. Actions that would have been unthinkable in their former lives became not just acceptable, but necessary for survival. The psychological adjustment required to live with this moral flexibility left permanent marks on the men who made it successfully. Some pirates dealt with the cognitive dissonance by compartmentalizing their lives completely. They would maintain elaborate mental separations between their criminal activities and their personal identities, telling themselves that they were playing roles rather than revealing their true natures. Others embraced the transformation fully, taking pride in their rejection of conventional morality and their willingness to live by rules of their own making. The relationship between individual identity and group membership became particularly complex in pirate communities, where men from radically different backgrounds had to learn to trust each other with their lives. Former slaves worked alongside former masters, Catholics alongside Protestants, educated gentlemen alongside illiterate labourers. The shared experience of outlawry created bonds that transcended the social divisions that had defined their previous lives, but it also created new forms of hierarchy based on competence, ruthlessness, and loyalty to the crew. The language that developed within pirate communities reflected these complex social dynamics. Pirates created their own vocabularies, mixing terms from different languages and cultures, while developing new words and phrases that captured experiences unique to their way of life. This linguistic evolution wasn't just practical communication. It was a form of identity construction that helped create the sense of belonging that was essential for crew cohesion. The religious beliefs that survived within pirate communities were often dramatically transformed by the realities of their lifestyle. Traditional Christian concepts of sin, redemption, and divine justice became problematic for men, whose daily activities violated every commandment and moral teaching they had been raised to respect. Some pirates abandoned religious belief entirely, embracing a materialistic worldview that focused entirely on immediate survival and pleasure. Others developed highly personalized spiritual practices that attempted to reconcile their criminal activities with their need for meaning and hope. These hybrid belief systems often incorporated elements from different religious traditions, folk superstitions, and practical philosophies that had proven useful in extreme situations. The result was a diverse collection of spiritual practices that would have been incomprehensible to conventional religious authorities, but that served important psychological functions for their adherents. The concept of time took on different meanings within pirate communities, where the normal rhythms of agricultural and commercial life had been abandoned. Pirates lived in an eternal present, where long-term planning was often impossible, and where the immediate demands of survival took precedence over all other considerations. This temporal perspective influenced everything from their approach to resource management to their understanding of personal relationships and future goals. The intensity of experience that characterized pirate life created psychological bonds and traumas that were unlike anything most people encountered in conventional society. Men who had shared the terror of storms, The exhilaration of successful raids and the constant threat of death developed emotional connections that were deeper and more complex than ordinary friendships or working relationships. These bonds could provide crucial psychological support during difficult times, but they could also become sources of conflict when loyalties were divided or when crew dynamics shifted. The constant proximity that defined life aboard ship created unique challenges was non-existent, and where personal conflicts for maintaining individual identity and personal boundaries. Pirates' har could escalate into deadly violence, within to learn to function effectively in environments where privacy minutes. The social skills required to navigate these challenges successfully were sophisticated and specialized, involving complex negotiations of status, respect, and personal space that had to be conducted within the constraints of the ship's physical limitations. The economic relationships that developed within pirate communities were equally complex, involving not just the formal profit-sharing arrangements specified in crew articles, but also informal systems of debt, favour trading, and mutual obligation that influenced every aspect of daily life. Pirates had to balance their individual economic interests against their need to maintain good relationships with crewmates whose cooperation was essential for their survival. The gambling that was ubiquitous in pirate communities served multiple functions beyond simple entertainment. Card games and dice provided ways to redistribute wealth within the crew, establish and test social hierarchies, and create excitement during the long periods between raids when boredom and tension could become dangerous. But gambling also created new sources of conflict and could destabilize crew relationships when debts became too large or when accusations of cheating arose. The treatment of money and material possessions within pirate communities reflected their ambiguous relationship with conventional economic values. Pirates often displayed remarkable generosity with their wealth, sharing resources freely and spending money with reckless abandon when they had it. This generosity served important social functions, demonstrating loyalty to the crew and establishing reputations for reliability and friendship. But the feast or famine nature of pirate economics also created psychological pressures that contributed to the violent and unpredictable behaviour that characterised many crews. Men who had been living in luxury after a successful raid might find themselves facing starvation within weeks if subsequent attacks were unsuccessful. This economic volatility made it difficult to develop stable long-term relationships or to maintain consistent standards of behaviour. The leadership challenges faced by pirate caps in any other form of humanings were unlike those in counter-organisation. These men had to maintain authority over crews who had explicitly rejected conventional forms of hierarchy and who could vote them out of office at any time. Successful pirate captains had to combine tactical competence with psychological manipulation, physical courage with political cunning, and personal charisma with ruthless pragmatism. The democratic ideals that many pirate crews embraced in theory were constantly tested by the practical realities of life at sea, where quick decisions were often necessary for survival, and where debate and consultation could be deadly luxuries. Captains had to know when to respect the crew's collective judgment and when to impose their will through force or intimidation. The balance was delicate and constantly shifting, requiring extraordinary sensitivity to crew morale and group dynamics. The process of decision-making within pirate crews involved complex negotiations between individual self-interest and collective welfare. Major decisions like target selection, resource allocation, and disciplinary actions were often made through formal voting procedures, but these votes were influenced by informal discussions, personal relationships, and unspoken threats that could be as important as the formal democratic process. The justice systems that pirates developed to handle internal disputes and disciplinary issues reflected their need to maintain order, while respecting the egalitarian principles that had attracted many men to pirate life and to be severe enough to deter miscon the first place. Punishments haddocked but not so harsh that they created resentment or rebellion among the crew. The most effective pirate justice systems were those that involved the entire crew in the process, making punishment a collective decision rather than the arbitrary will of the captain or officers. The integration of new crew members into established pirate communities was a complex process that involved both formal initiation procedures and informal hazing rituals designed to test the newcomers' commitment and compatibility with the group. These processes served important psychological functions, helping to establish the new members' place in the crew hierarchy while providing opportunities for existing crew members to assess their trustworthiness and competence. The cultural exchanges that occurred within pirate communities, where men from different national, ethnic, and social backgrounds had to learn to work together effectively, created unique forms of cross-cultural understanding that were rare in the broader Atlantic world. Pirates developed their own multicultural societies decades before such diversity became common in legitimate colonial communities, and their experiences provided valuable insights into the possibilities and challenges of intercultural cooperation. The technological innovations that emerged from pirate communities often reflected their unique combination of desperate necessity and creative freedom from conventional constraints. Pirates were willing to experiment with new techniques and equipment in ways that more conservative maritime communities might not attempt, leading to innovations in navigation, weaponry, and ship design that sometimes proved valuable beyond their original criminal applications. The medical practices that developed within pirate communities were shaped by the harsh realities of life at sea, where professional medical care was unavailable and where injuries and illnesses had to be treated using whatever resources were at hand. Pirates became skilled at emergency medicine, developing techniques for treating wounds, setting bones, and managing diseases that were often more effective than the formal medical practices of their time. The educational systems that emerged within some pirate communities reflected their need to pass on specialized knowledge and skills to new crew members while maintaining the security and effectiveness of their operations. Experienced pirates served as informal teachers, sharing knowledge about navigation, seamanship, combat, and survival that was essential for the crew's success and safety. The communication systems that pirates developed to coordinate their activities across vast distances and multiple crews were sophisticated networks that rivaled those used by legitimate commercial and military organizations. These systems involved not just the exchange of information, but also the development of codes, signals, and protocols that could be understood by Allied crews while remaining incomprehensible to their enemies. The record-keeping practices that some pirate communities developed, despite their generally low levels of literacy, were essential for managing the complex financial and logistical arrangements that governed crew operations. These records had to be detailed enough to ensure fair distribution of profits and resources, while being cryptic enough to avoid providing evidence that could be used against the crew if the records fell into hostile hands. The conflict resolution mechanisms that pirates developed to manage disputes without recourse to external authority were sophisticated systems that balanced the need for justice with the practical requirements of maintaining crew unity and effectiveness. These mechanisms often involved elaborate procedures for gathering evidence, hearing testimony, and reaching collective decisions that could be accepted by all parties involved. The recruitment strategies that successful pirate crews employed to maintain their numbers and attract skilled personnel were complex operations that required careful assessment of potential recruits' abilities, motivations, and trustworthiness. Pirates had to balance their need for experienced sailors against the security risks posed by men who might retain loyalties to their former employers or who might be government agents attempting to infiltrate pirate operations. The retirement and succession planning that some pirate communities engaged in reflected their understanding that individual careers in piracy were necessarily limited and that successful crews needed to plan for the eventual departure or death of key members. These planning processes involved complex negotiations about the distribution of accumulated wealth and the transfer of leadership responsibilities to younger crew members. The legacy management that successful pirates engaged in involved not just the preservation of their material wealth, but also the protection of their reputations and the welfare of their families and dependents. Some pirates made elaborate arrangements to ensure that their loved ones would be provided for after their deaths, while others attempted to rehabilitate their reputations through charitable activities or by providing information to authorities in exchange for pardons. The psychological preparation for death that was necessary for men engaged in such dangerous activities involved complex mental processes that helped pirates cope with the constant threat of violent mortality while maintaining the focus and determination necessary for effective action. Some pirates developed elaborate philosophical frameworks that helped them accept the likelihood of early death, while others relied on superstitions and rituals that provided psychological comfort in extreme situations. The trauma management techniques that pirates developed to cope with the psychological effects of violence, loss, and constant danger were sophisticated survival mechanisms that helped them maintain their effectiveness and sanity in situations that would have broken less resilient individuals. These techniques often involved forms of emotional compartmentalization, group support systems, and ritualized behaviors that helped process traumatic experiences. The identity maintenance strategies that pirates employed to preserve their sense of self while adapting to the extreme demands of their lifestyle involved complex psychological processes that balanced the need for flexibility with the human requirement for coherent personal identity. Some pirates maintained elaborate internal narratives that helped them understand their life choices and maintain their self-respect, while others adopted completely new identities that allowed them to function effectively in their new environment. The social capital that successful pirates accumulated through their networks of relationships, reputation, and accumulated favors was often more valuable than their material wealth in determining their long-term success and survival. This social capital could be invested in new ventures, used to secure protection during vulnerable periods, or converted into legitimate opportunities when pirates decided to leave their criminal careers behind. The knowledge management systems that pirate communities developed to preserve and transmit their accumulated expertise were essential for maintaining their competitive advantages and ensuring the survival of their specialized skills and techniques. This knowledge was often closely guarded and transmitted only to trusted individuals who had demonstrated their loyalty and competence over extended periods. The risk assessment methodologies that successful pirates developed to evaluate potential opportunities and threats were sophisticated analytical frameworks that balanced multiple factors, including potential profits, likelihood of success, probable casualties, and long-term consequences. These methodologies often incorporated complex calculations about weather patterns, naval patrol schedules, and economic conditions that required considerable expertise to execute effectively. The operational security practices that pirates employed to protect their activities from detection and interference by hostile forces were comprehensive systems that covered everything from communication protocols to personnel screening to physical security measures. These practices were constantly evolving as authorities developed new methods for detecting and countering pirate operations. The strategic planning processes that successful pirate crews employed to coordinate their activities over extended periods involved complex considerations of resource allocation, timing, and coordination that required sophisticated understanding of the broader economic and political environment in which they operated. These planning processes often involved multiple levels of decision-making and required careful balancing of competing priorities and objectives. The alliance management techniques that pirates used to coordinate activities with other crews and to maintain relationships with suppliers, informants, and other supporters were complex diplomatic processes that required sophisticated understanding of human psychology and group dynamics. These techniques often involved elaborate negotiations, formal agreements, and ongoing relationship maintenance activities that were essential for long-term success. The innovation management processes that some pirate communities employed to encourage and implement new ideas and techniques were informal but effective systems for identifying promising innovations, testing their effectiveness, and integrating successful innovations into standard operating procedures. These processes helped ensure that pirate crews remained competitive and effective in the face of changing conditions and evolving countermeasures. The quality control mechanisms that pirates developed to ensure the effectiveness of their operations and the reliability of their equipment were essential systems for maintaining the high standards of performance that were necessary for survival in their dangerous environment. These mechanisms often involved regular inspections, testing procedures, and maintenance schedules that helped prevent equipment failures and operational mistakes that could prove fatal. The performance evaluation systems that pirate crews used to assess individual and collective effectiveness were informal but sophisticated mechanisms for identifying strengths and weaknesses, recognizing superior performance, and addressing problems before they became serious threats to crew safety and success. These systems often involved peer review processes and collective decision-making that helped maintain high standards while preserving the democratic principles that many crews valued. The resource optimization strategies that pirates employed to make the most effective use of their limited supplies and equipment were essential problem-solving. These strategies often involved survival skills that required constant attention and creative complex trade-offs between competing needs and required sophisticated understanding of the relative value and importance of different resources under various circumstances. The contingency planning processes that successful pirates employed to prepare for various emergency situations were comprehensive systems that helped crews respond effectively to unexpected challenges and opportunities. These planning processes often involve detailed scenario analysis and the development of flexible response protocols that could be adapted to specific circumstances as they arose. The learning and adaptation mechanisms that pirate communities developed to incorporate new knowledge and adjust to changing conditions were essential for maintaining their effectiveness in a rapidly evolving environment where yesterday's successful tactics might prove useless or even dangerous today. These mechanisms often involved formal debriefing procedures and informal knowledge-sharing practices that helped ensure that lessons learned by individual crew members were transmitted to the entire group. The motivation maintenance systems that pirate crews employed to sustain morale and commitment during difficult periods were essential for preserving crew external circumstances, create cohesion and effectiveness when stress and hardship. These systems often involved a combination of material incentives, social recognition, and shared rituals that helped reinforce group identity and individual commitment to collective goals. The succession planning processes that some pirate communities employed to ensure continuity of leadership and operations were complex systems that balanced the need for stability with the democratic principles that governed crew decision-making. These processes often involved gradual transitions of responsibility and formal recognition procedures that helped ensure smooth transfers of authority when leadership changes became necessary. The reputation management strategies that successful pirates employed to maintain their effectiveness and protect their interests were sophisticated public relations operations that required careful attention to how their actions were perceived by various audiences, including potential victims, rival crews, government authorities, and the general public. These strategies often involved deliberate cultivation of specific images and careful management of information about their activities and capabilities. The psychological warfare that pirates waged against their own fears was perhaps their most sophisticated survival mechanism. Living with the constant knowledge that tomorrow might bring a storm capable of swallowing your ship whole, or that the next boarding action might be your last, required mental techniques that would impress modern therapists. Pirates developed elaborate rituals and superstitions not because they were particularly religious or mystical, but because these practices provided psychological anchors in a world where chaos was the only constant. The morning routines that many pirates followed weren't about hygiene or health, they were about imposing order on disorder. A pirate who checked his weapons in the same sequence every day, who tied his hair back with the same knot, who touched his lucky charm before climbing the rigging, was creating small islands of predictability in an ocean of uncertainty. These rituals served the same function as meditation or prayer, calming the mind and preparing it for whatever horrors the day might bring. But superstitions could also become prisons. Pirates who became too dependent on their lucky charms or ritual behaviours sometimes found themselves paralysed when circumstances prevented them from completing their usual routines. A man who believed his survival depended on wearing a particular shirt might become convinced he was doomed if that shirt was lost or damaged. The psychological comfort that superstitions provided came at the cost of flexibility and rational decision-making. The storytelling traditions that developed aboard pirate ships served multiple psychological functions beyond simple entertainment. When pirates gathered in the evening to share tales of past adventures, narrow escapes, and legendary figures from pirate history, they were engaging in collective therapy sessions that helped them process their experiences and maintain their sense of identity. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were instruction manuals for survival, cautionary tales about what could go wrong, and inspirational narratives about what was possible. The exaggeration that characterized pirate storytelling wasn't dishonesty, it was psychological necessity. When your daily reality involves levels of danger and hardship that would seem impossible to people living normal lives, you need stories that are larger than life to match the scale of your experiences. A pirate who had survived a hurricane might describe waves as tall as mountains, not because he was lying, but because ordinary language couldn't capture the terror and majesty of what he had witnessed. The hero worship that developed around successful pirate captains served important psychological functions for their crews. Men who were living outside all social conventions needed new role models, new examples of what it meant to be successful and admirable in their chosen world. A captain who could navigate by the stars, who always seemed to know when storms were coming, who could inspire loyalty in the most desperate circumstances, became more than a leader. He became a symbol of what was possible for men who had rejected conventional society. But this hero worship could also become dangerous when it prevented crews from making rational assessments of their situation. Pirates who became too devoted to charismatic but incompetent leaders sometimes followed them to disaster, unable to acknowledge that their hero had made fatal mistakes. The same psychological mechanisms that provided comfort and inspiration could also lead to collective delusion and catastrophic decision-making. The dark humour that pervaded pirate culture was another essential survival mechanism. Men who could joke about death, disease, and disaster were men who had found a way to rob these threats of some of their psychological power. Pirate humour was often grim and shocking by conventional standards, but it served the crucial function of making unbearable realities bearable. A crew that could laugh about their desperate circumstances was a crew that hadn't given up hope. This humour also served social functions, helping to defuse tensions that could otherwise explode into violence. When conflicts arose between crew members, a well-timed joke or a shared laugh about their mutual misery could sometimes restore peace without anyone having to back down or lose face. Pirates who could make their crewmates laugh were valuable members of the community, contributing to morale and cohesion in ways that were as important as skill with a cutlass or knowledge of navigation. The sexual dynamics aboard pirate ships were complex and often carefully managed through informal codes and agreements that recognized the potential for sexual competition to destroy crew unity. Most pirate crews were exclusively male, creating psychological pressures that had to be addressed through various coping mechanisms. Some crews developed elaborate hierarchies of sexual access when they encountered opportunities ashore, while others maintained strict codes that prohibited sexual competition entirely. The rare women who joined pirate crews occupied unique positions that reflected both their value and their vulnerability. Female pirates like Anne Bonny and Mary Read became legendary figures not just because they were successful criminals, but because they had navigated the complex social dynamics of male-dominated crews while maintaining their effectiveness as fighters and sailors. Their presence changed the psychological dynamics of their crews in ways that could be either stabilizing or disruptive, depending on how relationships were managed. The relationships between pirates and the sex workers who served them in port cities were often more complex than simple commercial transactions. These women provided not just sexual services but also emotional support, news from the outside world, and connections to the legitimate society that pirates had abandoned. Some pirates formed lasting relationships with particular women who served as informal wives, maintaining these connections across multiple voyages and providing emotional stability that helped offset the psychological stresses of life at sea. The medical knowledge that pirates accumulated through their harsh experiences was often more practical and effective than the formal medicine of their time. Pirates who survived multiple voyages became skilled at treating wounds, managing diseases, and performing emergency surgeries under conditions that would challenge modern medical professionals. This knowledge was passed down through informal apprenticeships, where experienced pirates taught younger crew members the techniques that had kept them alive. The surgical procedures that pirates performed on each other were often crude but surprisingly effective. Amputations were common and necessary when wounds became infected or when injuries were too severe to heal properly. Pirates developed techniques for performing these operations quickly and with minimal equipment, using whatever tools were available and relying on rum or opium to manage pain. The survival rates for these procedures were often better than those achieved by formally trained surgeons working in hospitals. The pharmaceutical knowledge that pirates developed was based on practical experience with various drugs and remedies encountered during their travels. They learned to identify and use medicinal plants from different regions, often combining traditional remedies from multiple cultures to create treatments that were more effective than any single tradition might provide. Pirates became walking pharmacies, carrying knowledge about dozens of different substances and their medical applications. The dental care that pirates provided for each other was particularly important given the dietary deficiencies and poor hygiene that characterized life at sea. Pirates learned to extract teeth using crude instruments, to treat infections with whatever antiseptics were available, and to manage the pain and complications that resulted from dental problems. Some pirates became skilled enough at these procedures to serve as informal dentists for entire crews. So there you have it, the brutal reality behind the romantic myths of piracy. These weren't swashbuckling heroes sailing pristine ships across azure seas. They were desperate men who had chosen a life where survival meant enduring conditions that would break most people, where every sunrise was earned through sheer stubborn will, and the bonds forged with equally desperate companions. The scurvy, storms and stench weren't just inconveniences, they were the three horsemen of a maritime apocalypse that claimed more pirate lives than all the naval battles and hangman's nooses combined. Yet somehow, through ingenuity born of desperation and communities built on shared suffering, they not only survived but created their own twisted version of civilization in the most unforgiving environment imaginable.